Section 3 then starts to think about different types of manager that you might see around your business. So hopefully you'll be familiar with some of these in your own working environment. Okay, first of all, then you've got your line manager. So probably the most easy to understand, the most obvious one where you think about your working environment itself. This is just where you're going to have somebody who has authority over a subordinate. So if you were the production manager, you'd expect you'd expect to have authority over your production line workers. So that would be an example of a line manager relationship. Staff manager then is where you're going to have some sort of expert advice or expert knowledge. So for example, you might consider a HR manager a staff manager when they're advising a manager in a different department about correct interview techniques. So there's some sort of advice being given even though it's in a different department because of that expert knowledge. A functional manager then is where you're going to have a manager of a particular function who may have authority over somebody else in a different function or different department. So for example, you would expect your finance manager to have authority to request timely reports from other departments. So some sort of production report, something like that your finance team are relying on at a certain time. Finally, then you've got project manager, and this is where you're going to have temporary control. So you might have authority over people who are in your project team, and it's very likely that those people will also have line managers elsewhere. And I guess it's important for us to think that, or to consider that there could be a conflict here. So for example, if you're asked to do something by your project manager and your line manager asks you to do something at the same time, well, who are you supposed to listen to? And that kind of gives us an insight into why conflict can arise around this area. Over the page then, just to point out here, section 4 we'll see later in chapter 3, so don't worry about the management hierarchy for now. Section 5 then starts to pick apart what a manager actually has to do. So this idea of the management process just gives us 4 key areas that you would expect a manager to have to, well, I guess you'd expect a good manager to have to excel in, but even an ordinary manager would have to deal with these 4 things. And I think it's important just to start right at the beginning here with planning. The very first thing that a manager will have to do is they'll say, well, what are the objectives that my organization have? Okay, so what are we aiming to do overall? And only when I know that can I start thinking, well, what's my part in that? What is my department's part or my team's part in that? So we set the plan. We start thinking about, well, what do I need to do? We're specific with it, so we're not general, and we're considering, the actual resources that we have to play with. So there's no point me having a pie in the sky plan if I don't have the resources to implement it. Leading and organizing then are all about taking that plan and making it happen. So let's start with organizing to begin with. Once I've got my plan, I then know where I'm going to utilize my resources. So we've said already that we use actual resources to think about making my plan, and then I decide in my organizing phase how I'm going to allocate those. So how I'm going to allocate time, how I'm going to allocate effort. That means that these plans, these specific aims are met. Over on the other side then we've got leading. So this is less about telling people what to do and more about making sure people feel committed towards the task. So generating motivation and so on, generating commitment amongst the team in order to get the best possible outcome. So we're taking the key resources that we have, I'm organizing them in a way that should help me to achieve my objectives, but at the same time, I'm focusing on that kind of human element. I'm focusing on the human side of things where I need to make sure people are motivated into working hard and achieving what I want them to achieve. We'll see a bit more on motivation later on in the course. Finally then we've got controlling, and controlling is just going to be saying, well, this is what I'm planning to do, this is what I want to happen, and this is what's actually happening. And the idea is we do this constantly, we do this throughout the process, so that if I need to take remedial action, I can take it as soon as possible. And this kind of 4-way arrow here is really just highlighting the fact that these are not 4 distinct stages, these are 4 things that are happening constantly. We're reacting to changes in the environment constantly as we work our way through. So it's really important to think about those 4 elements of the management process itself. Henry Mintzberg had a slightly, well, not a different view, but he had an alternate approach to this idea of the different tasks that a manager has to carry out. We split these into three key roles that a manager will have to adopt. So first of all, we've got the informational role. So this is all about information, all about data. So I take the data that I've received and I pass it on to whoever I need to pass it on to, whether that's within my team, whether it's externally. Also thinking about me being the spokesperson, so I'm representing my team. Interpersonal then, it is where we bring out those leadership qualities. So I link with managers of other teams and I represent my team. For example, at a conference, so I'm trying to utilize the personal skills that I have. Over the page then we've got the third role, which we call the decisional role, and this is essentially what you might think of your managers actually doing. So think about what your manager does on a day-to-day basis, and they're probably going to fall into some of these categories. So for example, taking those resources, we saw in the management process just before there how important it is that we plan based on the resources that we have. You might have some disturbances, so hopefully not too many disturbances at work, but a bit of a disagreement between team members perhaps, and they would have to sort that out. They might have to negotiate. So when we're thinking about allocating resources, maybe my negotiations would help to increase those resources. Okay, so maybe, for example, if we feel like we don't have enough staff members, maybe I could negotiate with HR to be given another headcount. Solve problems. So a key part of management is solving problems, whether that's something to do with the day-to-day running of the business, something to do with the future planning or something like that. And then finally, act as an entrepreneur. So trying to manufacture change, trying to drive change through the business. And again, when we spoke in an earlier chapter there about how important, for example, technology is around driving a business forward. This is where your manager has to step up and think about, well, how am I actually going to manage this change process? The final part of this recording then, we're just going to talk about business culture. So section 7 thinks about, well, why do I need to consider business culture in terms of management? And in fact, we would say that business culture would have a profound effect on management, on how they behave, on how they perform their roles. Well, I guess first of all we need to think about what we mean by culture. So the common assumptions, values and beliefs that people share, or another way to look at it is the way we do things around here. And if you've worked at one or two different companies or one or two different organizations yourself, you'll probably recognize that different businesses have very different cultures. Even if you've for example been out on audit with at different clients, you'll spot different cultures amongst those clients. Even it's sometimes difficult to put your finger on exactly what we mean by culture, but I think that's a nice way to look at it, the way we do things around here. Now, in terms of how that affects management, Quinn in 1995 said that, well, there's really two things we need to consider, two things that kind of drives the culture, or two aspects of culture that drives how a manager has to behave. And those are thinking about whether we have a flexible outlook, or whether we have a very control-based outlook, and then thinking about whether as a business we're inward or outward looking. And we kind of plot those, and you see in the matrix just beneath there, we plot those and we think about 4 different types of culture that we might need to consider when thinking about how a manager is supposed to behave. So this is really just driving that idea that you can't have a one-size-fits-all for management. There's no kind of correct way to manage. There has to be an understanding that you're adapting to the culture that you're faced with. And you can see here we've plotted those different cultures on my matrix, and then we've got a bit of a description underneath here. So we'll go through these in turn, and in fact we'll talk about internal business culture first, then we'll talk about rational goal culture, then we'll talk about open systems, and then finally we'll have a chat about human relations culture. So that's the order in which they're numbered there on the matrix. So an internal process culture then, you can see it is here, and you can see that it's very much an inward focused culture and very much focused on control. So the example we've got here is a public sector organization. So public sector organizations have to be focused on control because they have a limited resource. If you've got a limited resource, you have to make sure you're very efficient in your use of that resource. So it's very inward looking, very stable, very controlled. We know our goals, they're not changing. We know how we do things, we know the rules and procedures around that, and we carry on doing it. So it's a nice and stable. It's not a rapidly changing environment. You wouldn't expect to see an internal process culture with a changing environment. Rational goal culture is still focused on control. So we still have a set way to do things. We still have a set of procedures of how we do things, but this kind of term rational goal, we're really thinking about external requirements. So what does the customer want? What are our competitors doing? So it's much more outward looking, but still focused on that control. So if you've got a large established business who's been in operation for a long time, you'd certainly expect them to have a set way of doing things. The third and fourth culture then are going to be moving away from this idea of control, and they're going to be moving towards a bit more flexibility. And you might think to yourself, well, actually, surely a modern business needs to be quite flexible. So we'll maybe discuss that. So open systems culture then is certainly much more flexible in their way of operating. They're much more adaptable, and they're still maintaining that outward looking focus. So they're thinking about the fact that, well, if I can identify what's happening in the external environment now, then maybe that will provide me with an opportunity. I know that the market is changing constantly, so I have to be highly flexible. I have to be able to change. I have to be able to adapt. And the example we use here is maybe you've got a new business that's working in a fast changing technology, so something IT based perhaps, where you're constantly having to improve in order to avoid being left behind. And then finally we've got the human relations culture. So again, whilst being flexible, this time we're thinking, well, actually let's focus internally, and that's why we call it the human relations culture, because we're very much focused on our staff. So we're thinking about, well, what's the well-being, what's the best thing to improve the well-being of our staff. Staff are motivated then by this sense of belonging. So for example, a support service unit. So the idea that if we can create this team ethos, then people are going to be more motivated. The next recording then we'll move on to section 8, which will be looking at management models, but that's all for this one.